Like I've stated before, folk, the left have a very skewed view of what it means by an economic collapse.
Skyrocketing wealth inequality isn't just wrong, it's also weakening our economy.
Inequality is something natural that is part and parcel of human nature. We're all different from one another, we've all got different skill levels, etc. If you can think like a sports team game, like that of football, you've got players who are just naturally more gifted than other players and better in their position than other players. How the hell do you think the youth players learn and improve? By playing against those who are better than themselves. That's how they learn and grow. And it's not a negative, but the way that these socialists propagate it, and they constantly do so, if anything's unfair, it's holding back those who are more successful than yourself in order to try and equal things out. They've been pointing out this graph, and they've been showing that productivity levels are so sky high, but for decades now, the wages have been stagnant. That's a myth, folk. They keep propagating. It's the same thing when they spoke about that of the myth of the robber barons of the late 19th century, and they said that there was a dangerous concentration of wealth in the hands of the few, when there wasn't.
70% of the U.S. economy depends on consumer spending. 70%. So American consumers need to spend enough money to buy most of the goods and services Americans are capable of producing.
The market never asked for anything at all today with that of a paper currency, because the market was in favour of gold and silver in terms of free market money. Now I can understand that in American history, silver became the dominant standard for a period of time, right up till 1834, simply because they were fixing the ratio. That ended up wiping gold out of the market, made silver the dominant standard up until 1834. Again, they tried to get gold to enter the treasury. Silver out of the market made gold the dominant standard, simply because, again, fixing the ratio. They wouldn't leave the market be. The market determined what your money should be was gold and silver. That was fraudulently taken away for you. The market never for the life of it asked for anything at all to do with a paper currency. So fraudulence is what's taken all of the country, and have been running a printing press in order to try and finance things, whether it's social security, etc, etc. Of course, you've got all the unpaid pensions, the soaring debt crisis as a result of all the unpaid pensions, and all the liabilities for bailing out the banks, running the printing press, etc, etc, and inflation soared out of control. But he's going down the road to say, well, here's the reason why we need a higher minimum wage, because, yeah, you get the usual nonsense. Unquote. What is profoundly mystifying about this argument is that real consumption per capita increased during the very same decades of supposed income stagnation. As economist Alan Reynolds pointed out in his book, Income and Wealth, real consumption per person increased by 74% from 1980 to 2004. Average real wages and benefits have risen by nearly 40% since 1973 after adjusting for inflation. Sensational claims that 80 to 90% of Americans have experienced low stagnant real incomes since 1973 are also shown to be incorrect. Real consumption per person increased 74% from 1980 to 2004, a rate of improvement that far exceeded the trend from 1950 to 1979. And I've pointed this out so many times before that even backs this evidence. Unquote. Cox and Allen have demonstrated the upward mobility of the American labour force and the uselessness of static income distribution statistics as clearly as anyone has. To look at representative socioeconomic sample of American society, the two Federal Reserve Board researchers used a University of Michigan tracking study of more than 50,000 Americans that has been going on since 1968, tracking the incomes of specific individual families over time. In this case, from 1975 to 1991, provided an entirely different understanding of the degree of inequality in the American labour market from what static government statistics do, and the results were very revealing. And this time I'm going to go through each of the points that it mentions in the study. The first point, only 5% of families in the bottom fifth of the income distribution in 1975 were still there in 1991. More than 3/4 of them had made their way up to the two highest income quintiles. The poorest families made the largest gains. Those who started in the bottom 20% in 1975 had an inflation-adjusted gain in annual income of $27,745 by 1991. Those who started in the top 20% in 1975 also improved, but only by $4,354. The rich are getting richer, the researchers concluded, but the poor are getting richer even faster. That's quite important given the fact he was talking about the wealth inequality. The third point, less than 1% of the sample population remained in the bottom 20% during the entire time period under study. The fourth point, among the second poorest quintile in 1975, more than 70% had moved to a higher quintile by 1991, and 1/4 reached the top 20% bracket. With education and training, the rise up the income brackets can be very swift. More than half of the families who were in the bottom 20% in 1975 made it to a higher bracket within 4 years. The reason why they so badly need to spread that myth is so that they can try and further the agenda of socialism. The argument over inequality is just irrational. There's nothing wrong with inequality. How the hell do you think you learn from people who are better than yourself?
This means that over the long term, their incomes need to keep pace with their productivity.
And there you have it, folk. I've already covered that myth. This is the myth where he's basically trying to say that productivity levels have driven up and somehow wages have been stagnant for decades.
But their incomes haven't. Over the past 40 years, most people's wages have basically stagnated, while worker productivity has soared.
Is that the reason why consumer consumption per person has increased dramatically? Again, folk, you can look there at the quote and you can see for yourself that all he's doing is just talking pish.
Where did the economic gains go? Mostly to the top.
The same myth about the dangerous concentration in the hands of the few. It was the same in the Industrial Revolution, and it's the exact same myth to this very day.
The wealthy now own more of the economy than at any time since the 1920s. Here is the economic problem. The wealthy spend only a small percentage of their income and wealth.
Folk, I can more than understand that you're living under a corporatist system where government gets to pick and choose winners and losers, and of course it's a system where government rewards failure and punishes success. In other words, anti-capitalism. I don't need to go into all that. He's trying to say that the rich are not spending. Well, how the hell does he explain that Jeff Bezos' company Amazon has been selling millions of products worldwide every single year? When it comes to wealth, wealth is consumer consumption. If wealth was done to wages, the Venezuelan people would be stinking filthy rich. But there lies the problem. Because of hyperinflation, because of continual printing of the currency, the Venezuelan people can barely even buy one toilet roll with that of all the paper money that they've got. In other words, all the money is merely just an exchange for the things that you get. Consumer consumption has driven up.
Their spending is not enough to fulfill the consumer demand that keeps the economy churning.
We can only go out to eat so many times a year. We can only get so many haircuts a year. We can only get, 3 pairs of jeans will do ya,
Oh my god, folk, Nick Howner again, because he is the epitome of what a political entrepreneur is. A political entrepreneur is basically a cronyist, because they know fine well they would get eaten alive in a free market economy. That is to say that the reason why they've got the interests or the socialist government interventionism in there is so that they can, hoard the position that they're getting. In other words, they typically benefit for this type of system. All this wealth inequality, in other words, he's just spouting all the pish. They actually sit there and go, yeah, I believe you. I believe everything you say, just because it's anti-capitalism. They sit there and they clap like seals because they don't even have a clue what he's even going on about. They can't even see it staring them in the face.
Lower income people, on the other hand, spend almost everything they have, which is becoming very little. Most workers are not earning nearly enough to buy what the economy is capable of producing.
Folk, I can more than understand that there's a problem today in terms of housing costs, education, healthcare, etc. And it's like I say, in terms of the healthcare and education costs, that's been all because of the government's intervention. And even people have rightly pointed out about zonal laws when it comes to this whole thing today with the housing, etc. And there has been such a problem where the market can't keep up with the demand. It's all been because of the absence of the free market. But they want you to believe that it's all down to two things. Take for example healthcare. They want you to believe that it's down to a question of universal healthcare or what you've got with the main American healthcare market today. In other words, they want you to believe that the main American healthcare market today is somehow free market when it's no.
The result is a gap between potential output and potential consumption. To fill the gap, the economy depends on people going deeper and deeper into debt so they can buy.
Folk, I can more than understand. It's a lassie there that's obviously taking out a student loan that's probably more than that of a house mortgage. You can understand why they end up in so much debt, etc. That's no the fault of the market, that's the absence of the free market. That's been created through all the government intervention. You ever noticed when he speaks about the debt as social security? That's because of all the unpaid pensions, folk. Funny how he never mentions anything about that to do with the social security and the unpaid pensions.
Even in 2018, when the economy appeared strong,
with not being over the 2008 financial crisis, that your economy appeared to be strong. All Donald Trump did was he reallocated spending into another area of the economy. Ron Paul warned you about that. Of course, nobody would listen. They don't want to take the debt crisis seriously. And I've got nothing against Donald Trump as such.
40% of Americans had negative net incomes and were borrowing money to pay for basic household needs. The Fed has had to keep interest rates lower and lower to accommodate this buying.
That's exactly what has led to the boom and bust cycle, and they keep on trying to blame it on capitalism. But what is that doing? It's sending out wrong signals to the market. The market is basically saying you've got a shortage of savings, you've got a shortage of resources, so why the hell would you then artificially lower the interest rates? All that's going to do is create the boom, which is to say it's going to create consumer demand to go out and borrow and spend during a period when there's a shortage of resources and a shortage of savings. And what do you think's going to happen when you increase consumer spending during a period when there's a shortage of resources and a shortage of savings? Doesn't it take a bloody genius to work that one out now, does it?
And the government has to spend more and more to fill the remaining gap.
It needs to start cutting back on all the socialist pish. That's exactly what it needs to do. It needs to start getting rid of the social security. It needs to start taking the debt crisis seriously. But you don't want to. You're living away in cloud cuckoo land where you think you can afford this social security and all this pish, and you don't want to acknowledge it. Why have you no mentioned anything about all the unpaid pensions? It would contradict you. You want to brush that under the carpet?
None of this is sustainable. At some point, widening inequality causes the economy to collapse.
What the fuck? It's because of all the spending on wars that they couldn't afford. It's because of all the welfare programs, because of all the social security, because you're trying to prop things up that you can't even afford. How the hell are you supposed to sort out a debt crisis if you're spending money that you've no got, that you're just continuing on running the printing press? You at your treehouse or something?
We've seen this before. Years ago, Mariner Eccles, chairman of the Federal Reserve from 1934 to 1948, explained that the Great Depression occurred because the buying power of most Americans fell far short of what the economy was producing.
But doesn't he mention anything about how they were restricting productive output, and all thanks to FDR and all these policies, etc. He doesn't mention anything about the fact that consumer prices were driving up because of the likes of FDR and the intervention of the market. And in other words, they did that to so-called protect the farmers.
He blamed the increasing concentration of wealth at the top. Quote, a giant suction pump had, by 1929, 1930, drawn into a few hands an increasing portion of current produced wealth. As in a poker game, where the chips were concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, the other fellows could stay in the game only by borrowing.
For your information, folk, in 1922, the Federal Reserve intervened in the market and used open market operations for manipulating the interest rates. Again, that would create the boom and bust. Of course, they would run the printing press as they took away the gold standard temporarily at that period of time. You would end up seeing the soaring inflationary problem eventually go bust because of the fact that there's a shortage of resources and savings, etc. Hoover didn't take the advice of Mellon to leave things to liquidate. Instead, it continued on with the borrowing spending, ended up escalating the problem, and then just led on to that of prolonging the Great Depression thanks to FDR. His type would like to have you believe that somehow FDR was the great saviour to America's depression. The depression would have been over within about 2 years if it was left onto the market, but
when their credit ran out, the game stopped, unquote. While the wealthy of the 1920s didn't know what to do with all their money, most Americans could maintain their standard of living only by going deeper and deeper into debt. When that debt bubble burst, the economy tanked. Fast forward 100 years, and we see the same pattern. While the typical American's wages have barely budged for decades, adjusted for inflation, most economic gains have gone to the top. Just as Eccles's so-called giant suction pump drew an increasing portion of the nation's wealth into a few hands.
Something I never mentioned there was today with Thomas Sowell's example and how the whole thing with the Fortune 500 it isn't fixed. In other words, it's a change of businesses all the time. You've even seen this with regards to the internet. You'll remember how MySpace was a large, social media company. And then before you know it, it's shrank to a fraction of its size. Because of the fact that they change in the market, just like the local grocery store he speaks about. After the Second World War, more and more motors on the road, the introduction of the supermarkets. Because the supermarkets were more convenient to them and they were able to fill up their motors, they weren't really going to that local grocery store, so it dropped down to a tiny fraction of the size of what it initially used to be. The point being is the fact that just like the Fortune 500, it's ever changing. It's not the same people.
Before the Great Depression. The result has been an economy whose underlying structure is far more fragile than it may seem. Remember the housing and financial debt bubbles that burst in 2008? We avoided another Great Depression then, only because the government pumped enough money into the economy to maintain demand.
You're not even over the 2008 financial crisis. All they've done as a result of all the bailouts, running the printing press in order to bail out the banks, etc. All they've done is they've kicked the can down the road. In other words, they've escalated the problem. When it came to that of the quantitative easing, QE1 failed, QE2 failed, and QE3 failed. The lockdowns, all that did was it accelerated the recession forward. If anything caused the crisis, it was because the bad banks became too big to fail because of the government's protectionism, because the government's always there to protect them from their losses. Forcing the taxpayer to collectively pay for the losses of them enabled illegally protected fraud. Bailouts is essentially rewarding failure. You're rewarding incompetence, encouraging legally protected fraud, because you're basically saying, don't worry about your failure. We'll just continue on bailing you out. We'll just continue on rewarding you for the wrong that you're doing. It makes the taxpayer collectively poorer.
And the Fed kept interest rates near zero. And then came the pandemic. The Fed has had to keep interest rates near zero.
Exactly, and that's what encouraged the investment banks, etc., and the lending institutions to get away with the large-scale lending of the mortgages to that of subprime borrowers.
And the government has had to pump even more money into the economy.
You make it sound as if that was the solution to come and save the day. It was the bloody well cause of the problem. More and more inflation into the economy. You just escalated the problem. You created an even bigger bubble.
Well, these programs have been crucial to staving off a pandemic-induced depression. They're only temporary. Over the long term, the real worry continues to be on the demand side. Widening inequality means not enough demand. America's wealth gap is now more extreme than it's been in over a century. Until this structural problem is remedied, the American economy will remain perilously fragile. It will also be vulnerable to the next demagogue, wielding anger and racism and resentment as substitutes for real reform. Closing our staggering wealth gap is crucial.
So folk, what he's really basically saying here is he wants more control over the economy, and that's essentially what it means in terms of trying to close this wealth gap, etc. In other words, the antithesis of liberty. It's actually through more of the government's regulation, more control over the economy that resulted in the rise of all these oligopolies, these monopolies and the cartelisation, etc. And what's he going to argue for? What do you think the rich are just going to do? They're just going to pass it off onto the consumer? Somebody that's just going to run the economy right into the ground?
To the survival of both our economy and our democracy.
Basically try to call the United States of America a democracy. I've never set foot in the United States of America in my entire cream puff, and even I can tell you that the United States of America is a constitutional republic. If that was the case, the Second Amendment would have been gone long ago. It's the reason why you hate everything America stands for, because they stand in defence of something that stands in your way. And that is to say that you want to take away their right to bear arms to protect themselves themselves so that you can then easily use the state to trample all the tap of them. Ain't that bloody well right? Because your type basically want to force them in a direction of socialism where you're just going to lead America is straight down the road of totalitarianism, because that's the only place that socialism can lead. So anyway, folk, hope you've enjoyed the video. I don't know if you've got anything you would like to add in yourself and maybe stuff that I've missed out or that. Be sure to like the video, share the video, and of course I'll be sure to get back to you. Thank you for watching, and I shall talk to you later. Cheers.